We are dealing with the end of the world that we know. Russia is more of a symptom of this than a cause. So, to go back a little bit, in the world before World War II, if you had coal, oil, food, and iron ore, you could industrialize and try to make something of yourself. But if you failed to have one of those, you were probably a colony. At the end of the war, the Americans abolished the imperial system and patrolled the global oceans for everyone. And as a result, now you only needed one of those four, and you could trade for the others. And so for the first time in human history, we were all on the same path, from different starting points and going at different speeds, but we were all industrializing and we were all urbanizing. The problem, well, let's start with the opportunity. When you urbanize, you move from the farm and into town to take an industrial job. When you live on the farm, you have a lot of kids because they're free labor. You move into the city, you have a lot fewer kids because kids are no longer free. They're really expensive and noisy and annoying and dirty pieces of furniture. And you have fewer of them. And so your population starts to shift. It used to be that you have loads of children, a few young adults, fewer retirees. It's kind of a pyramid. But as you urbanize, your pyramid opens up into a column because you have fewer kids, but everyone's living longer. And as long as your population is a column, economic growth is spectacular because you don't have to spend a lot of money on your kids. You're not old enough that you have a lot of retirees. But you got a lot of people in their 20s and 30s to build things and buy things, and then a lot of people in their 40s and 50s to do the investing. And the rich world was a population column from 1945 to 1992. And with the end of the Cold War, the developing world became a column in 1992 until now. The problem is that this is all temporary because birth rate keeps dropping, people keep living older, and your column eventually inverts into an open pyramid, upside down. And now you no longer have children, you no longer have a replacement generation at all. And there aren't enough people in their 20s and 30s to buy everything. And there aren't enough people in their 40s and 50s to pay for the retirees. So this decade was always going to be the decade that most of the advanced world moves into mass retirement and the economic model collapses. And next decade was always going to be the decade that that happened to the developing world. And we found out recently that the Chinese have jumped the ship, and this is their last decade too. So all of the globalized connections and consumptions that create the world we know, we are at the end of it. And we have to go back to a world where trade is more focused on the countries that have a better demographic and security infrastructure because the Americans are no longer patrolling the global oceans anymore. So we're losing the security ramifications of an open system. At the same time, we're losing the demographic capacity to support it in the first place. And that's all going down right now.
Well, by the time we got past 1983 and the last royal nuclear scare with the Soviets, relationships were steadily warming until the Cold War ended, in which case Russia was at least temporarily invited into the family of nations. So the structure of globalization was able to spread to the entire population of the world. At the same time, we were in this hanging moment demographically, where we knew that birth rates had been dropping for decades, and that meant in a lot of the advanced world we were rapidly running out of children. But we still had all kinds of adults that had not yet aged into retirement. So we had this massive block of workers and consumers that were driving every part of the economy that we would ever want to be driven. It wasn't sustainable because there were no children. But for about 35 years, we were in this glorious moment where all things were possible, where there's plenty of finance, where there were no security risks, and where anyone who wanted to play a part in the international trading system could, and it was backed up by just these massive waves of workers and consumers. It was perfect. It was temporary. The moving around and the spreading around is certainly the issue. So globalization encouraged every country who wanted to play, even if these were countries that could never have been economically successful on their own in a pre-globalized system. So as a rule, and again, oversimplification, if the British Empire thought you were worth conquering, you probably couldn't make a go of it on your own. And so you had all these countries that had been colonies that all of a sudden under the American-led globalization model could play and didn't have to worry about their security. And in that sort of environment, the countries with good geographies, your United States, your Frances, your Britons, faced competition from a quarter that they never had before. And since they didn't have to worry about security costs, all of a sudden they were the low-cost producer for a lot of manufactured goods. And so we saw an industrial hollowing out of the advanced economies writ large, going to some of the secondary ones that have had a really hard time of it before. I might add this includes Germany. In that sort of environment, whether or not the wealth was distributed was a political decision to be made by the countries on the receiving end of that. So in the case of Korea or Germany, we got relatively egalitarian societies. In the case of Indonesia and India, not so much. And so I'm cautioning you against conflating the overall globalized trends and then decisions that were made at the local level. There are interrelationships, but it's definitely not causal. Let's look back at the Chinese history for a second. Here the Han ethnicity has been around for 3,500 years. But despite all that history, the Han Chinese have only been in charge of the bulk of the Chinese population for about 300 years. This is a place with a horrible geography, incredibly water poor in some parts, very rugged in others. And that means they've never been able to pull it together themselves. All of the Chinese empires of old, very few of them lasted more at their peak when we see all those maps in our books. In many cases, those maps only lasted for a few years, sometimes only for a few weeks before it all went to hell. And that's before you consider rampaging outsiders coming and wrecking the whole thing. So you only have about 300 years of unified Chinese history. Half of that is under the Mongols. Half of the rest is since 1945, when the Americans sent the Europeans and the Japanese home. So this myth that China has always been the biggest component of humanity is just that, a myth. And it was only with the globalized system in 1945 that the Chinese finally didn't face an external oppressor and could get around to the busy work of consolidating their own country under Mao. Fast forward to the Nixon-Mao summit of the 70s, and in order to turn the Chinese against the Russians, the Chinese were invited into the globalized order by the Americans. And that created the China that we know. A China with no security threats, a China with access to a world full of raw materials and markets. So this is an artificial construct carried out under an artificial environment in the most atypical period in human history. So of course they did well, but you break any part of that. You remove the Americans from the equation and globalization breaks. You look at their demographics and play it forward, and you see that they don't have a workforce, and this goes away. So China, just like the world at large, has enjoyed the best 35 years of its history, and it's over. It's like the idea of producing goods for yourself sounds great until you want something that is more advanced than yarn. Specialization is what brings us the modern world. It's what's allowing this call right now, linking two continents together in real time. The idea that any one country could pull that off is asinine. And that's before you start considering the fact that we now have over half of the human population dependent directly on food imports, and about 3/4 of the world's population dependent upon fertilizer imports so that they can grow their own food. The degree of interconnectivity that we have is extreme. And if you break down the trade links that make all of that possible, we don't get to do this with 8 billion people.